Life Stories.
Life Stories Worldwide with another story sharing good news. And tonight we have a guest who spent time recently in America for quite a while, but he's back in the UK. He's going to be sharing with us tonight. But tonight, please pass on to your friends, your neighbors, your work colleagues. Tell them about this program that's on tonight, live on Zoom, on Facebook, and on YouTube. Tell them to watch this, encourage them. And if you have any prayer requests or any needs tonight, please contact us on our hotline. You can see the number on the screen, 0794 355 0287. Or if you're outside the UK, then you need to put +44 in front of that number. You can phone, you can WhatsApp, you can text, and someone will get back to you as soon as possible. You can also go to our website, LifeStoriesWorldwide.com. You can go to our website, and there you can find out more information about the work that we're doing. But tonight, as I say, we've got a guest who's spent time in America, but his life changed when he was 17 years old. Something happened to him then, which he'd probably share about. And then he spent time going throughout the UK after studying at college, doing all sorts of ministry, seeing many, many miraculous healings, which he may share about tonight. I hope he does. And then he's been in America, I think, for 18 years, I think he'd been in America. But now he's back in the UK and believing for good things to happen in the UK. And so right now, I want to hand it over to Keith Tipple. He's going to share his story tonight. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Alan. It's a great privilege to be here and have this opportunity to share how I came to real faith in Jesus Christ and how he really changed my life, even as a young man many years ago. But let me just put a little background. I was brought up in a coal mining village in the heart of Nottinghamshire, not too far from the town of Mansfield. Most of the boys, when they left school at around about the age of 15, went to the coal mine to work, and I did exactly that. My dad had worked at the coal mine basically all his life. And like many young people, especially boys, but it's a girls' sport as well these days. I wanted to be a professional footballer. That was my only dream. As far as church went, or religion, or believing in God, I can honestly say that even from kind of an early age, if you'd asked me, did I believe in God? I would have said yes, like many, many people would. But the problem was I didn't know him. I believed there was a God, but that's as far as it went. So my life, existed really around one kind of dream, and that was one day to get a call from who was the manager then of Manchester United, Sir Matt Busby, but that never came. But I really dreamt that one day I would become a professional football player. But my life really changed when I was 17 years of age. My uncle had moved away from the village and fallen in love with a lady about 12 miles away. And before they were married, her brother and sister-in-law were really staunch Christians. They were really zealous for the Lord and wanted them to start their married life out in church and really coming to know Christ. So my uncle would come every weekend to see us and to see his parents that also lived in the village. And I remember vividly one day he said, I've started to go to church, which we felt was quite unusual because we weren't church goers. We went like most people do, probably, as they say over here, for hatches, matches and dispatches, for christenings or baby dedications, weddings and funerals. And that was about it. But he came one weekend and he said, you know, everybody in our church is really happy. Now, I'd never connected church with happiness and with joy. So that kind of intrigued me. And so he kept coming every weekend telling us about what had been happening in church. And then one weekend he came over and he said, you know, last Sunday I was saved. And I looked at him and I had no idea what he was talking about, because in the religious sense, I'd never heard that word saved. As far as I was concerned, it meant maybe he'd been out swimming in a lake and got into trouble and somebody dived in and brought him to shore. So what do you mean by being saved? He said, well, the preacher was talking about how Jesus loved us so much, died upon the cross, and if I repented of my sin, I could be saved or born again or receive Christ into my life. And he says, I did that last Sunday. Now, I could see a definite change in his whole appearance. And each weekend he would come over and he would talk to us about how his life had changed and what was happening in this church. And I would throw at him all the hard questions I could think of that, you know, I thought he may not be able to answer. And if he couldn't answer them, he just said, well, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll ask the pastor and I'll be back next week. I'll give you the answer. So anyways, it was really through him. He was instrumental in causing me to start to think and on a journey which eventually led me to a real experience with God. There was a little church only about a mile away from where we lived, similar church to what he'd started to attend. And I went one Sunday evening, and much to my surprise, there were young people there. It was only a small church, but everybody was happy. And I thought, this is really intriguing. So several weeks went by. And, you know, my dad used to say to me, you don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't do this. If you want to be a professional footballer, you look after yourself and all the rest of it. So I obeyed his word to the letter. But as I was sat in church for several weeks, although I thought to myself that I was as good as anybody else, my dad always used to say to me, if you live a good life, you don't do anyone any harm, you're as good a Christian as anyone, and if there's a heaven, one day you'll be sure to get there. And that's what I based my life upon. But as I listened to the preacher this particular night, he began to point out that although I thought I was good, he said, we've all fallen short of God's standards. We've all sinned. And all I can say to you tonight is that looking back now, I can understand what was happening. At that time, I couldn't, but all I could understand was I began to feel that I desperately needed God, and that God could come into my life, Jesus could save me, and that I was actually a sinner just as much as anybody else, in desperate need of the forgiveness and salvation and new life of Jesus Christ. I remember the date like it was yesterday. It was actually the 17th of October. I was in a Sunday evening meeting, and the preacher gave an appeal for those that wanted to come to know Jesus Christ. And I, with a few other people that Sunday night, gave our lives to Christ, prayed a simple prayer. Afterwards, I walked home. It's only about a mile away from where we lived. I can remember this vividly. I walked straight into the front room. The coal fire was burning. My mother and father were watching what was a show every Sunday night in those days, Sunday night at the London Palladium. And I stand in front of the TV set and I said, Mum, Dad, tonight I'd become a Christian. My dad says, just move away from the TV set, boy. It will pass. Whatever you've got, it will pass. But, you know, I began to talk to them. I began to pray for them. And I can honestly say tonight, within 12 months, my parents and grandparents had all come into a wonderful knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. And we were all baptized in water together one Sunday evening. What a wonderful night that was. And, you know, my mother and my grandmother came first. They came with me to church, and they gave their lives to Christ. And then eventually my dad came. And his pattern was that he would come every Sunday night to the gospel service, as it was then. And then he would come home, and eventually he'd go down to the miners' welfare where they would have a drink with his friends. And about 10 o'clock, he'd come back, and that was the pattern. Well, this particular Sunday night, he'd listen to the preacher. He comes back home. He goes off to the miners' welfare, to the public house, if you like. And within about half an hour, he's come back. And I said to him, Dad, what has happened? Have you run out of money? Do you need a loan? And he says, I don't know what's happened. He says, I'm sat there. And he looked astonished himself. He said, I'm sat there with a pint of beer. I'm looking round at where I am. And he says, and a voice inside me said, what are you doing here? He says, you're not going to believe this. He says, I've left half a pint of beer and I'm never going in that place again. Well, that night, he had a vivid dream. You could really describe it as a nightmare, really. But he dreamt that he and I had gone to the coal mine, and we'd got on the elevator or the lift, or in those days they call it the cage. It was literally a cage that took the miners down to the pit bottom, 400 odd feet below. And he and I had got onto this elevator, this cage, with a number of other men. And it's going down slowly. The winding gears starting slowly to go down. Then halfway down this pit shaft, if you like, the winding gear snapped. And so this cage was hurtling to the bottom to sudden death. And all these miners were crying out for fear. As they were, the top opens up in his dream, and I shoot up like an astronaut, and he's going further down, and he's shouting, Keith, Keith, Keith. And then at that moment, God in his dream says to him, Keith is saved. You're not. And he woke up in a cold sweat. And at 6 o'clock that morning, on his way to work, he asked Jesus Christ into his life. And he was born again, saved by the power of God. And then my grandfather was wonderfully saved. So, as I said, all the family came to the Lord in an amazing way within 12 months. I remember at that time, we were watching the BBC one night, and in those days, well, in fact, even today, they don't put a lot of good religious programs on, but it was very rare in those days. But the BBC had actually gone to a church in Manchester, and there were two pastors called Barrett and Williams, and they were seeing a lot of miracles happening within the church, so much so that the newspapers were picking this up. And of course, the BBC took their
Stories. Life Stories.
Took their cameras live into one of their evening services, and we were watching this. It probably lasted about 30 minutes or 40 minutes, the whole program. But there's a lady walks down the aisle. She's helped down the aisle. She's blind. And Barrett and Williams, the two pastors, pray for her. And she falls to the floor, and immediately her eyes are opened and she can see. And other things were happening in this program. And when the program finished, I remember discussing this with my parents, and none of us were skeptical. We couldn't fully understand it. But looking back now, that had an impact in my life. And like many things, there's kind of little links in the chain that bring us to that point of where we really surrender our lives to Christ. And that really did have an impact on me. I think it must have been about a year or so later that two young men decided to take this documentary film around some of the churches around the country. And they were coming to a church in Mansfield one Friday night. So I thought I'd really like to see this again because it had impacted me. So I'm sat in this meeting, I watched this documentary again. And at the end of the service, the pastor said, we're now going to take up an offering for these two young men who were traveling the country, evangelizing, sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And it was at that point that an inner voice, it's not an audible voice, but just an inner voice in my spirit, which I know was the voice of God. And the Lord said to me, this is what I want you to do. And that was when God called me to the ministry, and particularly to the ministry of evangelism. So I thought, what's the next step? And for me, it was to go to Bible college for 2 years. Whilst I was in college, a pastor in the northwest of England, Wigan, who I call my pastor, is with the Lord now, but Ray Belfield, he knew I wanted to go into evangelism. So by the end of my 2-year period, he was planning up a town-wide crusade. We used to call them crusades, let me say mission, a town-wide evangelistic mission. And he was going to put a tent, 500-seater tent in one area of Pemberton, in another area for another week in Ince, and then it was going to come back into the church for a week. Well, we leafleted just about every home in Wigan. After I left college, I went up to assist the evangelist. And I remember that tent going up this particular night, and Ray looked at me and he said, do you think we could fill this tent? He was getting a little bit nervous. I said, sure, because I'd worked with this evangelist before. And by the time 7 o'clock came, the meeting was due to start at 7:30, people were filing in. And the tent, 500-seater tent, was, getting comfortably filled. All I can say to you tonight is that as the evangelist preached the gospel and prayed for the sick, from the opening night, God began to do some wonderful, wonderful miracles of healing. So much so that the newspapers came. And the following week, we were moving the tent over to a place called Ince, the other side of town. And we pitched this tent in between two public houses, the Fox Tavern, and I can't remember the other one, but it was in the car park. And there was a young woman, 30 years of age, called Sheila Horrocks. She was living in a little bungalow, little house, about 50 yards from where we pitched the tent. She sat outside in a wheelchair, waiting for that meeting to start. Her husband pushed her in. I can see him now like it was yesterday. He pushed her right to the front, left her there in the wheelchair, and he disappeared. He didn't want anything else to do with it. The tent fills up because the newspapers were picking up what was happening. And at the end of the meeting, as we prayed for Sheila, she'd broken her back in 6 places. She had asthma, angina, and epilepsy. And immediately she was prayed for. God wonderfully healed her. She stood up, she walked, she walked up and down the aisle. And most of the people, 90% of the people in that meeting were non-church goers. They'd never been in anything like it before. They were stood on the canvas chairs, whistling, cheering. They didn't know to shout hallelujah or amen. They were just so excited. And she was walking up and down. Well, when that happened, the newspapers, the next Friday, the Wigan Observer, on the front page, and I've still got the pictures in my scrapbook, the front page is a picture of her outside the wheelchair, standing upright, and the caption over the front page was, "Paralyzed mum walks again." When that hit the newspapers, people were coming from all over England, and we were in that tent till midnight and gone most nights, just praying for people after we preached the gospel. And so much so that one night, there were so many people wanting to be prayed for. And I'm just the song leader. I'm just the assistant. I'm happy to do whatever. But the evangelist looks and he sees all this long line of people and says, "Who'll have Brother Keith to pray for them?" I thought, what on earth has he just said? I'll sing a song, I'll do something, but, I'm not the one praying for this. But before I could, breathe, basically, there's a long line in front of me. And the first man in line, I said to him, "What do you want me to pray for?" He said, "I'm blind in one eye." Well, all I can say is tonight that the atmosphere was absolutely electric, just with faith that somehow I didn't doubt. I just put my hand over his eye and prayed for him, and God instantly opens his eye. And that kind of thing was happening night after night after night. So the 3-week mission went on for 6 weeks. And then afterwards, Ray, the pastor, says, "You better stay on and start visiting these people." And the following summer, I did 8-day tent missions all around different areas of Wigan, praying for the sick and seeing hundreds of people make decisions for Christ. And that kind of launched me into a nationwide evangelistic ministry, where we would often go into, with the Assemblies of God churches, we'd often go into towns and communities where there was no real good evangelical, full gospel, church. And we'd start a church. We'd hire a hall 2 or 3 weeks and preach, 6 nights out of every week. And we'd pray for the sick and leave people behind, and the church would be started. And that was the kind of thing that happened. I want to just tell you, we went to Shrewsbury, and we had the castle, which was at that time the council chambers. Were in the castle, and we hired the council chambers for our meetings. There was a ballerina came in one night with a collapsed lung that God wonderfully healed. Little girl with a twisted foot. But one night when we were in the town of Daventry, there was a family came from Coventry, and they brought a little girl, and she's in a wheelchair. She's probably about 4 or 5 years of age, and she's like a little, cabbage. She can't hardly talk. She can't really see much. She's got a brain tumor. Her parents said, she's only got weeks to live. Would you pray for her? And I said, of course we will. So at the end of that meeting, we prayed, and nothing. There was no visible signs of any improvement at all. And I just said to her parents, look, you know, let's believe God. We'll keep praying. And a year later, I was in a church in Coventry doing a mission. And just before the meeting started, one of the elders at the church came into the room that the back of the church and said, Keith, there's a gentleman would like to see you. I said, well, that's fine, you know, bring him in. So this gentleman comes in. He says, you probably won't remember me, but you probably would remember my daughter. And he described her. And of course, I couldn't forget her. He says, well, I want to tell you what happened. When we got back that night, we would lay our little girl at the bottom of our bed because she used to vomit every night. And he said that night we laid her at the bottom of the bed. And he said at 3:00 in the morning, she sits bolt upright and says, I'm not. I'm not going to die. When I think about this, excuse me, I get emotional. He says, I brought her to see you. And from the back of the church up the aisle runs a 6-year-old little girl, wonderfully healed. He says, from that night, she started to get better. And thank God, the Lord had wonderfully and marvelously healed her. And, you know, it's just a privilege to see to see God working, changing people's lives. And tonight, you may be listening wherever you are in the world. And I want to recommend a wonderful, wonderful Savior to you. We have been so blessed over the years that, we've pastored churches in the Lake District, we've started churches, we've preached in many different countries all over the world. And, we've been so privileged because really I'm a nobody that God just took up and changed my life. But, we've been to Uganda many, many times, and we help to support about 18 village pastors. And in one little village, the pastor is really the kind of pastor of pastors, if you like, a little village in Kapiani. And the superintendent of the Ugandan Assemblies of God is a guy called Cephas. And he's a dear friend of ours. And he said to me, one of the first times we went to Uganda,
Life Stories.